The story begins with Bruno, a black man, entering a jewelry store in a quiet town, hoping to buy a watch for his young son, Theodore. He walks through the door, carefully choosing the perfect timepiece as a special gift. The store is clean, well-lit, and exudes an air of sophistication, with luxury items displayed on glass counters. Bruno's calm demeanor contrasts with the expensive setting, and his focus is entirely on picking out something that would bring joy to his son. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with a stiff attitude, attends to him politely but with an underlying tension, perhaps sensing something different about Bruno compared to the usual customers. The atmosphere suddenly shifts when a commotion erupts. A man dashes through the front door, his face covered, quickly snatching several valuable items from the display case. In a panic, the shopkeeper shouts for help, and the thief escapes into the streets, leaving behind a scene of chaos. The police are called immediately. Officer Alvin, known for his tough and aggressive approach, arrives at the scene shortly after. Without investigating the situation thoroughly, he zeroes in on Bruno, who was still standing in the store. Bruno is immediately accused of being the thief based on no clear evidence. His protests are ignored as Officer Alvin roughly grabs him and places him under arrest. The tension in the store reaches a boiling point, and Bruno is subjected to a humiliating and unjust treatment. The tension in the jewelry store escalated rapidly after the thief fled the scene. The once quiet atmosphere of the store was now filled with confusion and fear. Shattered glass lay on the floor, a stark contrast to the pristine surroundings. The storekeeper, visibly shaken, was scrambling to assess the damage. His eyes darted nervously as he looked around, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. A few seconds earlier, everything had seemed normal, just another day of business. But now, the store felt like the scene of a crime, the air thick with anxiety. As soon as the police were contacted, Officer Alvin arrived on the scene. Known for his brash, quick-to-judge demeanor, Alvin was a figure that many in the town recognized. He wasn't the type to waste time analyzing a situation. He preferred to act quickly, sometimes too quickly. His entry into the store was abrupt. He barely greeted the shopkeeper, who was still trying to regain composure from the robbery. Officer Alvin's eyes scanned the room with a calculating gaze, as if he were already deciding what had happened. Upon hearing the details from the shopkeeper, Alvin turned his attention to Bruno. The shopkeeper, still trembling from the shock, was trying to explain the sequence of events but struggled to articulate clearly. Bruno, who had been standing by the counter, watching the commotion unfold, was suddenly the focal point of the officer's suspicion. His calm demeanor, perhaps unusual in the chaos, seemed to draw unwanted attention. Alvin walked over to Bruno, sizing him up with a hard stare. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice sharp and authoritative. Bruno, taken aback by the sudden focus on him, explained that he had simply been shopping for a watch for his son, Theodore. His story was straightforward, but Officer Alvin wasn't interested in details. His mind had already made up a narrative. A man like Bruno, black and out of place in the upscale store, must have had something to do with the robbery. In his mind, the situation was clear-cut, an immediate assumption that Bruno was the culprit. Before Bruno could react, Alvin's hand shot out, grabbing him by the arm. "You're coming with me," the officer declared, ignoring any protest from Bruno. The shopkeeper tried to interject, pointing out that Bruno had been there to buy a watch and hadn't acted suspiciously. But Alvin, unyielding, dismissed his words with a wave of his hand. "I'll sort this out," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Bruno, now caught in a whirlwind of events, tried to resist, but the officer's grip was firm. "Let go of me. I haven't done anything wrong," Bruno shouted, trying to free himself. His voice, filled with confusion and frustration, echoed in the store, but his words fell on deaf ears. Officer Alvin wasn't listening. He was convinced that the man before him was guilty. There was no need for questions, no room for doubt. The police officer's treatment of Bruno was quick and aggressive, bordering on violent. It was clear that Alvin wasn't interested in hearing Bruno's side of the story, nor was he open to any possibility other than that the black man in front of him was a criminal. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. The shopkeeper, desperate to prevent further conflict, stepped forward once again, his voice shaky. "Please, officer, he wasn't involved. I can vouch for him," he insisted. But Alvin's expression remained cold and uninterested. "I'm doing my job," he snapped back, as if his decision had already been made and no further discussion was needed. The air was thick with tension as the officer continued to force Bruno towards the exit, his actions more and more forceful with every step. Bruno's heart raced. The injustice of it all struck him like a punch to the gut. How could this be happening? He hadn't done anything wrong. But the officer's assumption was all that seemed to matter. As the officer dragged him out the door, Bruno's mind raced for a solution. But before he could think of anything, the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, and he was shoved into the back of a squad car. The world outside the car window seemed to blur as the gravity of the situation sunk in. He was being treated like a criminal, all because of the color of his skin. The accusations against Bruno were baseless, but the town had already started to form its own narrative. Word spread quickly, and soon enough, the robbery became a story of a black man who had stolen from an upscale store. Bruno's name, his innocence, his entire identity, was being overshadowed by this assumption. The injustice was not just in the arrest, but in the fact that he was already being judged before anyone had the chance to hear his side of the story. As Bruno sat in the back of the squad car, a flood of emotions consumed him: fear, anger, confusion. How was he supposed to prove his innocence in a town where he was already presumed guilty? His thoughts turned to Theodore, his son, and the watch he had hoped to buy. All of that now seemed distant, a mere afterthought compared to the nightmare unfolding in front of him. The officer's harsh words and actions lingered in his mind, each one like a sharp sting, further alienating him from the possibility of justice. The squad car moved slowly through the streets, its sirens blaring as Bruno sat in the back, hands cuffed tightly. His mind raced with confusion and fear. What was happening? He had been accused of a crime he didn't commit, dragged away from the store where he had been shopping for a gift for his son. Now, trapped in the back of a police car, Bruno's thoughts spun wildly. Was this really happening? Was he being treated this way because of the way he looked? Upon arriving at the police station, Bruno was led into a holding cell without any explanation. He sat there, feeling both anxious and helpless. He hoped that someone would soon realize the mistake. Hours passed, and still no one came. The silence of the cell made it feel even worse. He couldn't understand why he was being treated like this. He was just a man trying to buy a gift. Yet somehow, he found himself accused of something he didn't do. Finally, the door to his cell opened. Officer Alvin and another officer stepped inside, exchanging a brief glance before Alvin turned to face Bruno. He seemed angry. "You think you didn't do anything wrong, don't you?" he asked sharply. Bruno wanted to explain, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Alvin didn't seem interested in hearing anything Bruno had to say. Without any further discussion, the officers removed Bruno's handcuffs, only to force him toward a chair where they made him sit uncomfortably. Alvin began pacing in front of him, his tone harsh. "You think you can get away with this?" he said, his voice full of accusation. Bruno opened his mouth to speak, but was immediately interrupted. Alvin wasn't listening. The officers began asking him questions that made no sense. Bruno felt the pressure build inside him. Every attempt to explain himself was met with further frustration. They didn't want answers. They just wanted him to confess to something that wasn't true. Alvin's voice grew louder, more forceful, as Bruno struggled to stay calm. The officers weren't listening to his side of the story. The frustration in the air was palpable. Bruno's mind raced, trying to hold onto his sense of self, to keep his composure despite the overwhelming pressure. They wanted him to admit something he hadn't done, and yet he stayed silent, hoping that someone would eventually realize the truth. The questioning continued for hours. Though he was exhausted and overwhelmed by the situation, Bruno remained determined. He refused to confess to something he wasn't guilty of. Finally, the officers left him alone in the room. His body ached, and his spirit felt worn down. But he had not broken. Despite everything, he held on to the truth. In the midst of the chaos that surrounded Bruno, there were several key individuals who played pivotal roles in his journey, each with their own motives, backgrounds, and complex relationships with the central events unfolding around him. First, there was Officer Alvin, whose actions and demeanor shaped much of Bruno's experience during the time of his detention. Alvin, though a seasoned officer, had a reputation for being stern and unwavering in his methods. His tendency to view situations in black and white, without much regard for nuance, made him a figure of authority that Bruno could neither challenge nor escape. The relationship between Bruno and Alvin was one defined by power dynamics. From the moment Bruno was brought into custody, Alvin's intentions were clear: to extract information, to break him down, and to force him into a confession. The personal animosity Bruno sensed from Alvin was palpable, and it only grew as the hours passed. Bruno's attempts to communicate or plead his innocence were met with scorn, as if Alvin had already decided Bruno was guilty before any evidence had been presented. However, it wasn't just the officers that Bruno interacted with. There was also Eva, a young woman who worked as a legal assistant at the firm that was handling his case. Eva had only recently started her position, but her passion for justice and her belief in fairness made her an important ally to Bruno. Unlike the cold demeanor of the police officers, Eva's approach was more compassionate. She listened to Bruno's side of the story with empathy, something he desperately needed in that moment of helplessness. Eva's relationship with Bruno was one of mutual respect, built on trust. She believed in his innocence and would stop at nothing to help clear his name. Over time, their relationship grew stronger as they worked together to uncover the truth. Another key figure in this story was Bruno's sister, Maria. Maria had always been protective of her older brother. Having grown up in a neighborhood where the law was often viewed with suspicion, she had seen firsthand how the police sometimes targeted people who didn't fit the societal norms, and she was determined to support Bruno no matter what. Maria's relationship with Bruno was one marked by unconditional love and loyalty. While Bruno was trapped in the system, Maria was fighting tooth and nail on the outside to ensure he wasn't forgotten. She contacted lawyers, reached out to family friends in influential positions, and relentlessly pursued any lead that could help secure his release. Her resilience and determination were a source of strength for Bruno, especially when he felt as though the system was working against him. In addition to these characters, there was also Detective Mason, an experienced investigator who was called in to handle the case. Unlike Officer Alvin, Detective Mason was more measured and thoughtful in his approach. He was neither as harsh nor as quick to judge as his colleagues. His role in the story was one of potential redemption, as he sought to uncover the truth of what had happened to Bruno. Though his relationship with Bruno began on tense terms, with Mason having to navigate through the complexity of the case, over time, a more collaborative dynamic developed. Mason began to question the assumptions that had led to Bruno's arrest, and his growing sense of doubt made him an important ally in Bruno's fight for justice. The relationships between these supporting characters and Bruno were complex, shaped by a mix of loyalty, duty, suspicion, and empathy. As the story unfolded, these connections would either serve to help or hinder Bruno in his quest for justice, illustrating the profound impact that relationships can have in times of crisis. Through their actions, each character contributed to the broader narrative of Bruno's struggle to clear his name and fight against the injustice that had been forced upon him. Racial discrimination and unjust treatment are unfortunately recurring themes in the lives of many individuals, and Bruno's story was no exception. From the very beginning of his ordeal, he faced prejudices rooted in both overt racism and the systemic biases that plagued the institutions designed to protect and serve. As Bruno sat in the interrogation room, he couldn't help but reflect on the experiences that had shaped his understanding of the world. Growing up in a neighborhood where racial tensions were always high, Bruno had long been aware of the way people of color were treated differently, especially by law enforcement. It was not just the hostile looks or the whispers behind his back. It was the way the system itself seemed stacked against him at every turn. He had watched his friends and family members suffer from the same injustices, their stories often ignored or dismissed. But this time, it was his own story. and it was unfolding in a much more terrifying way than he could have ever imagined. The moment he was detained, Bruno knew that his race was going to play a central role in how he was treated. His initial arrest was a result of a wrongful accusation, a case of mistaken identity that occurred in a neighborhood with a long history of profiling. The officers who detained him were quick to point out his ethnicity as a factor in their suspicion. There was no evidence, no real reason for his arrest other than the color of his skin. Yet, it was the assumption of guilt, based purely on his race, that led to his detention. As he was transported to the holding facility, Bruno could feel the weight of history bearing down on him. He had seen countless people like him endure the same fate, those whose lives were derailed by racial profiling and the bias ingrained in the system. He could already sense that this was going to be a long, uphill battle. He was being treated as a criminal, not because of any wrongdoing on his part, but because he fit the description that law enforcement often relied on: a young man of color in a high-crime area. The interrogation that followed was a direct manifestation of the systemic racism that had defined Bruno's experience. Officer Alvin, the one tasked with questioning him, had no interest in hearing Bruno's side of the story. Instead, he focused solely on casting Bruno as a suspect in a crime he didn't commit. There were no attempts to find evidence, no efforts to investigate further. Bruno's race alone seemed to be enough to justify the harsh treatment he received. The officer's tone was condescending, his questions accusatory, and his demeanor cold. It was clear that Bruno's answers weren't going to change the officer's mind. The case was already closed in Alvin's eyes, because Bruno, as a young man of color, was guilty by default. As the days dragged on, Bruno's treatment only worsened. He was placed in a cell with others who were also victims of racial discrimination. The conversations among the detainees often revolved around their shared experiences of being unfairly targeted by law enforcement. Many of them had similar stories, times when they had been stopped for no reason, searched without cause, or even arrested based on the flimsiest of allegations. They spoke about the helplessness that came with knowing that the law, which was supposed to protect them, was instead a tool used to oppress them. Bruno listened intently, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. He realized that, in many ways, he was just another name in a long list of people who had suffered because of their race. In addition to the overt discrimination, there was the subtle but equally damaging kind of racism that Bruno faced from the legal system. The moment his case was brought to trial, it was clear that the odds were stacked against him, despite the lack of evidence, and even the testimonies that contradicted the accusations. Bruno's race was used against him. His public defender, though well-meaning, struggled to navigate the complexities of a system that seemed more interested in securing a conviction than in pursuing justice. Throughout the trial, the focus was not on the facts, but on Bruno's background, his appearance, and his neighborhood, elements that made him an easy target for a biased jury. The trial was a reflection of the racial inequalities that permeated every part of Bruno's life. His case was just one of many, and while it was personal to him, it was also part of a larger pattern of racial discrimination that had been going on for generations. The unjust treatment he faced was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a much deeper societal issue. A system that treated people like Bruno as suspects before they were ever given the chance to prove their innocence. Ultimately, Bruno's story is a painful reminder of the ongoing struggle against racial discrimination and unjust treatment. His experience was one of many that highlights the stark realities of how people of color are often treated by law enforcement, the legal system, and society as a whole. The scars left by these injustices are not easily healed, but they serve as a call to action, urging society to confront the biases that continue to shape its institutions. For Bruno, as for so many others, the fight for justice was far from over. Family conflict and struggles have always played a significant role in shaping the emotional and psychological landscape of individuals. And for Bruno, this was no different. His story was not just about the external challenges he faced, but also about the internal battles within his own family. These familial tensions not only compounded his personal struggles, but also reflected the deeper issues of societal expectations, generational differences, and the pressure to navigate a world that often seemed hostile and unfair. Growing up, Bruno was always aware of the difficult relationship his parents had. His father, a strict and traditional man, expected his children to adhere to a set of high standards that often felt suffocating. Bruno, the eldest son, felt the weight of these expectations more acutely than anyone. His father had a clear vision for his life, one that involved pursuing a stable career, following a strict moral code, and ultimately becoming a person who could be proud of the family's name. However, Bruno's personal dreams didn't align with his father's rigid ideals. He was more inclined toward exploring his passions, questioning the status quo, and forging his own path, which often led to clashes between them. These ongoing disagreements created a distance between Bruno and his father, one that became particularly pronounced when he reached his late teens. It wasn't that Bruno didn't love or respect his father. He did. But the constant pressure to conform to an ideal that felt foreign to him was exhausting. His father's lack of understanding for Bruno's desires and struggles only deepened the rift. Every decision Bruno made seemed to be met with disapproval, and each time he tried to explain himself, he was met with a wall of silence or, worse, harsh reprimands. His mother, caught in the middle, often tried to mediate, but her own fears and anxieties about the future of the family led her to side with his father more often than not. This left Bruno feeling alone, misunderstood, and disconnected from the very people who were supposed to support him unconditionally. The tension at home was further amplified by the racial discrimination Bruno faced outside. His father, who had grown up in a more conservative and less diverse environment, struggled to understand the racial struggles that his son endured. Bruno would often come home, frustrated after an encounter with law enforcement or feeling ostracized at school, only to be told that he needed to work harder to prove himself or that his experiences were exaggerated. To his father, such struggles were seen as obstacles that could be overcome through hard work and perseverance. However, Bruno realized that it wasn't just his own efforts that determined his future, it was the world around him, one that didn't always play fair. Bruno's relationship with his siblings also became strained as his conflict with his parents deepened. His younger brother, who had always looked up to him, started to pull away, finding solace in the same expectations that Bruno had rebelled against. This caused a fracture in their relationship, as Bruno could no longer be the role model he once was. His sister, on the other hand, became more vocal in her support for Bruno, but she was often caught in the crossfire of their arguments. As tensions at home reached their peak, the household dynamic became increasingly toxic, with each member retreating into their own corners to avoid confrontation. It was during this time of heightened family conflict that Bruno found himself caught in a difficult situation. The pressure to conform to his father's expectations, coupled with his own personal struggles, created an emotional toll that he didn't know how to handle. His sense of identity was fractured, and he began to question not only his future, but also his place within his family. His father's rigid ideals and his mother's quiet resignation left him feeling isolated, unsure of how to bridge the gap between who he was and who his family expected him to be. The external conflict of his wrongful accusation only added another layer of complexity to the family dynamic. Bruno's father, once proud of his son's achievements, began to view him as a failure. His mother, torn between supporting her son and trying to maintain the family's reputation, found herself conflicted. The accusations against Bruno were not only a personal blow to him, but also a blow to the family's image. The shame and guilt that his parents felt manifested in their treatment of him, and the stress of the situation only intensified the rift that had been forming for years. Bruno's family struggle was not just a personal matter. It was reflective of larger societal pressures and the cultural expectations placed on families of color. For many families like Bruno's, success and survival in a world that often marginalized them meant adhering to specific roles and expectations. The clash between individual desires and family obligations became even more pronounced as Bruno's case became more complicated, and his struggle for justice became a struggle for family unity as well. In the end, Bruno's family conflict wasn't just about the clash of personalities or ideals. It was about the way societal expectations and racial struggles shaped the dynamics within his home. The pressure to succeed, to conform, and to navigate the complex realities of being a person of color in a world that often didn't understand him weighed heavily on Bruno. And while the support of his family was fractured, it also became clear that their shared struggles were part of the larger story of identity, survival, and the pursuit of justice. Tense situations and inner struggles often define the emotional landscape of someone caught between external pressures and internal conflicts. For Bruno, these moments were a daily reality as he struggled to balance the weight of accusations and the pressure from both his family and society. The external conflict of proving his innocence was compounded by the internal turmoil of questioning his self-worth and identity. From the moment the accusations surfaced, Bruno was thrust into a whirlwind of emotions. On the surface, he tried to maintain composure and hold on to some semblance of normalcy. But inside, he was unraveling. It wasn't just the legal battle he had to face. It was the emotional toll of being judged without the opportunity to defend himself. The accusation became a stain on his character, and the constant questioning of his integrity left him feeling isolated and vulnerable. Each day, as he walked through the streets or interacted with others, he was reminded of how quickly people would judge him without knowing the truth. The stares, the whispers, the avoidance, it all weighed heavily on him, making him question whether he could ever escape the shadow of suspicion that now followed him. At home, the pressure was no less intense. His family, already struggling with their own issues, became further strained by the ongoing turmoil. Bruno's father, a man who valued honor above all, was conflicted. He loved his son, but also felt torn between supporting him and maintaining the family's reputation. Bruno's refusal to conform to his father's expectations only deepened the rift between them. His father wanted him to quietly accept the situation, to make amends and move on. But Bruno couldn't bring himself to do that. For him, it wasn't just about saving face, it was about standing up for the truth. Meanwhile, his mother, though loving and protective, was overwhelmed by fear. She saw the toll the accusations were taking on Bruno and worried for his future. She didn't know how to help him, and her anxiety only added to the already existing strain. The conflict between wanting to shield her son and facing the harsh reality of the situation created a constant inner struggle. She longed to protect him, but in her heart, she knew that the world outside might not be as forgiving. Bruno's younger siblings also struggled with their own emotions. His younger brother, who had always admired Bruno's strength, started to distance himself, unable to cope with the tension. His younger sister, on the other hand, became more vocal in her support, but her own fears about the future made it difficult to provide the comfort Bruno needed. The family dynamic shifted, and each member found themselves caught between their loyalty to Bruno and the overwhelming fear of what might happen next. Internally, Bruno's struggle intensified. The constant pressure from his father's expectations, his mother's fears, and the judgment from society made him question his place in the world. He had always prided himself on being a person of integrity, but now he found himself doubting everything. Should he continue fighting for the truth, knowing that it might cost him everything? Or should he succumb to the expectations placed on him, accepting the status quo in the hopes of finding peace? These questions tormented him, and each day felt like a battle against himself. Despite the weight of these struggles, there was a quiet strength in Bruno, though the pressure seemed unbearable at times. He refused to let the world define him. He was determined to prove that he was more than the accusations that had been made against him. In the face of uncertainty, he clung to the belief that standing up for what was right would ultimately guide him through the turmoil. These moments of doubt were some of the hardest for Bruno, yet they also shaped his resilience. The tension between external expectations and his own internal convictions became a defining feature of his journey. Every decision, every interaction, and every step forward was marked by the struggle to reconcile these forces within himself. Even in his most vulnerable moments, Bruno found a way to keep pushing forward, driven by a desire to restore his honor and rebuild his life. No matter how difficult the path ahead seemed, stories of resilience and learning often reveal the strength of the human spirit when faced with adversity. For Bruno, the path toward healing and personal growth was not linear, but rather a journey filled with setbacks, moments of doubt, and, Ultimately, the discovery of inner strength he never knew he had. The accusations and struggles he faced became the catalyst for his transformation, pushing him to evolve in ways that shaped his future. In the beginning, Bruno was overwhelmed by the weight of the accusations against him. He struggled with feelings of helplessness and anger, unsure of how to navigate the complexities of his situation. Each day felt like an uphill battle, and the burden of constantly defending himself wore him down. But as time passed, something shifted within him. He began to realize that while he couldn't control the actions of others or the perceptions they held, he could control how he responded to them. One of the first lessons he learned was the importance of self-awareness. Bruno began reflecting on his actions and reactions, questioning how he could better manage his emotions in the face of overwhelming pressure. He learned to step back and assess situations more rationally, choosing not to react impulsively or out of anger. This shift in mindset allowed him to approach challenges more calmly, finding solutions rather than getting lost in the emotions of the moment. Another significant lesson for Bruno was the power of vulnerability. Throughout his struggles, he often felt isolated and disconnected from those around him. However, as he opened up more to his family and friends, he found that expressing his feelings and fears created stronger connections. The support he received from those who truly understood his struggles became a source of strength. By sharing his experiences and acknowledging his vulnerabilities, he was able to build a network of people who genuinely cared for his well-being, helping him regain his sense of self-worth. Bruno also learned the importance of perseverance in the face of adversity. There were many moments when he felt like giving up, when the obstacles seemed insurmountable, and the idea of clearing his name felt like an impossible dream. However, through sheer determination, he refused to let those moments define him. He kept pushing forward, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. He learned that resilience wasn't just about bouncing back from failure. It was about continuing to move forward, even when the path was unclear. One of the most profound lessons Bruno learned was the value of empathy and understanding. As he navigated his struggles, he gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of the people around him, especially his family. He recognized that his father's stern expectations, his mother's fears, and his siblings' reactions were all shaped by their own experiences and challenges. This realization allowed him to see his family members with greater compassion, helping him rebuild those relationships that had been strained by the conflict. In turn, this empathy helped him reconcile his own inner conflicts, as he realized that everyone, including himself, was just trying to do the best they could in a difficult situation. Throughout this journey, Bruno also discovered the power of self-forgiveness. He had spent so much time blaming himself for the situation he was in, questioning his choices and decisions. However, as he continued to reflect on his journey, he began to understand that holding on to guilt and shame only kept him trapped in the past. He had to forgive himself in order to move forward, to learn from his mistakes without letting them define him. This was one of the most freeing realizations he had, as it allowed him to release the emotional baggage that had been weighing him down for so long. Through all these lessons, Bruno's journey became one of profound personal growth. Each challenge, each setback, and each moment of doubt led him to a greater understanding of who he was and what he was capable of. He emerged from the experience more resilient, more compassionate, and more self-aware. What once seemed like an insurmountable obstacle became the foundation of his growth, and he realized that the greatest lessons came not from his triumphs, but from the struggles he had faced along the way. Bruno's story is a testament to the power of resilience, the ability to rise after each fall, to learn from pain, and to transform adversity into personal strength. It is a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is potential for growth and renewal. And as Bruno learned, the key to navigating life's challenges is not just about surviving, but about learning and evolving with each experience, ultimately becoming a stronger and wiser person. The conclusion of Bruno's journey represents more than just the end of a series of trials. It marks the beginning of a deeper understanding of himself and the world around him. His experiences, full of conflict, adversity, and personal growth, offered invaluable lessons that shaped the man he would become. These lessons, learned through hardship, remain as reminders of the strength of the human spirit and the importance of resilience. One of the core lessons Bruno learned is that life's challenges are inevitable, but how we respond to them defines our path forward. In the face of hardship, Bruno was often tempted to retreat, to allow his anger, frustration, and sorrow to dominate. However, he slowly learned that stepping back and reflecting was key to maintaining control over his actions. He came to understand that while he couldn't always change the circumstances or the opinions of others, he had the power to choose how he would respond. This awareness became a guiding force in his life, helping him navigate difficult situations with more composure and clarity. The second major lesson Bruno took away from his journey was the importance of self-awareness and self-compassion. Early in his struggles, he was consumed with self-blame, constantly second-guessing his choices. However, through self-reflection, he discovered that growth comes not from beating oneself up over mistakes, but from understanding them, learning from them, and moving forward with a renewed sense of purpose. Bruno learned to embrace his imperfections, recognizing that no one is perfect, and that it's our ability to learn and evolve that truly matters. Self-compassion became essential in his healing process, helping him break free from the cycle of guilt that had once held him back. Another important lesson was the significance of vulnerability and the value of opening up to others. Bruno initially isolated himself, fearing judgment or rejection from those who might not understand his situation. Yet, as he began to express his struggles to those closest to him, he discovered the immense power of connection. Sharing his experiences with family and friends allowed him to build stronger relationships and find support in times of need. He realized that vulnerability is not a weakness, but rather a source of strength that fosters trust and empathy, ultimately leading to greater resilience. The notion of perseverance was also central to Bruno's transformation. There were countless moments when it seemed easier to give up, when the weight of his struggles felt unbearable. Yet, Bruno chose to press on, no matter how daunting the road ahead. His perseverance allowed him to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and with each small victory, he gained the confidence to face the next challenge. The lesson here is simple yet profound. The key to overcoming adversity is not in avoiding it, but in persisting through it. The resilience to continue, even in the face of defeat, is what ultimately defines success. Bruno's journey also taught him the importance of empathy and understanding, especially within his family. Through the conflicts and misunderstandings that arose, he learned that everyone has their own struggles, their own pain, and their own way of coping. By recognizing the human element behind each person's actions, Bruno was able to view his family's responses with more compassion. This newfound empathy allowed him to rebuild the strained relationships and see his family in a more holistic light. It was through this understanding that he found peace, not only with others, but also within himself. Perhaps the most profound lesson of all was the power of self-forgiveness. Bruno carried a heavy burden of guilt for much of his journey, unable to forgive himself for what he perceived as mistakes or failures. However, in time, he learned that true healing comes not from punishing oneself, but from accepting one's flaws and learning to let go of past mistakes. By forgiving himself, he freed himself from the chains of guilt, allowing him to embrace his future with a renewed sense of hope and purpose. In conclusion, Bruno's journey was one of immense personal growth, filled with pain, struggle, and ultimately, transformation. Through his trials, he learned invaluable lessons about resilience, self-awareness, compassion, perseverance, empathy, and forgiveness. His story is a reminder that while life's challenges may seem overwhelming at times, they are also opportunities for growth and self-discovery. By embracing these lessons, Bruno was able to emerge from his struggle stronger, wiser, and more equipped to face whatever life might throw his way. Ultimately, his journey teaches us that the road to healing is not a straight line, but one that requires patience, perseverance, and the willingness to learn and grow from our experiences.